Hey, I'm Bacon, and I'm going to wade into the rules as written / rule zero debate or the conversation. Really, it's more of a conversation, whatever it is. I'm just going to dive right in. I'm starting off with the largest kind of a block quote, so pardon me while I get there. In I Fought the Law, Transgressive Play and the Implied Player, ESPENAARSETH says the following, quote, clearly, players cannot exist without a game they are players of. A generic player is an unthinkable, not merely a historical figure. Games, on the other hand, can exist without actual current players as material and conceptual game objects or texts. While the game without a player is a limited perspective, it does denote a hierarchical relationship. The historical player cannot exist without a game. But the game at some point in its existence, example, before the first playtesting session in a development cycle, can exist without players, and always without one particular historical player. The potential player, before becoming an actual player, must receive some instructions either from the game itself or from a guide or accompanying material. Thus, the player is created by these instructions and by his or her initial learning experience. End quote. Further into this same article, but not too much further, he provides a quote of his own. Quote, in Truth and Method, HANS-GEORGGDAMER argues that games are the real subject in play, not the players. And here's the start of his quoting Gadamer. Quote, all playing is a being played. The attraction of a game, the fascination it exerts, consists precisely in the fact that the game masters the players. Whoever tries is in fact the one who is tried. The real subject of the game, this is shown in precisely those experiences where there is only a single player, is not the player but instead the game itself. What holds the player in its spell, draws him into play, and keeps him there is the game itself. End Gadamer's quote. And then I'm going to continue Arseth. By accepting to play, the player subjects herself to the rules and structures of the game, and this defines the player. A person subjected to a rule-based system, no longer a complete free subject with the power to decide what to do next. End quote. The whole thing. Arseth offers a hermeneutic, Gadamerian, and asymmetrical understanding. Hermeneutic understanding arises through active engagement and interpretation, not passive reading. Gadamerian, the player is constituted by the game, not vice versa. And asymmetrical, the game defines the conditions of play. The player acts within those limits. The system precedes the subject. Now, this also means that the game structure is prior, ontologically and epistemologically, and the player is shaped by the game, not merely invited to shape it, which includes GMs who are not exempt from the game's constitutive force. If they are operating within a TTRPG framework, then they are still players, as Arseth briefly defines it within the context of his article, one subjecting themselves, quote, to the rules and structures of the game, and this defines the player. A person subjected to a rule-based system, no longer a complete free subject with the power to decide what to do next, end quote. What does this mean then? When I say the game structure is prior ontologically and epistemologically, it is a philosophical claim about the priority of systems over subjects. When we say the game structure is prior ontologically, it is in terms of being or existence. The game exists as a structure before any particular person is defined as a player of it, by it. And when I say it's prior epistemologically, it's in terms of knowledge. The rules and systems of the game define what knowledge is possible or valid within the game space. Said another way, The game's mechanics, systems, and written content exist independently from and prior to the players, which it define the conditions of play, and set the limits on what can be known, done, and recognized as valid by the players within the structure of play. You can't know what a critical hit is or what initiative means until the game's system gives it meaning. And that meaning always precedes you. This pushes back against the idea and generally assumed tenet of Rule Zero proponents that the player is sovereign or that play is whatever I want it to be. No. It's what the structure allows, and only then what you choose within that allowance. So while Rule Zero does grant procedural flexibility, it only does so from within the rules themselves, and it does not abolish the game's formative authority over its participants. Instead, even Rule Zero must be read, interpreted, and accepted as a rule. In that sense, the game still masters the player, as Gadamer put it. Thus, Rule Zero is not outside the game. It is the ritualized mask the game wears when it says, you may alter me, but only through me, and further still, only when specifically stated. So even the Gygaxian toolbox, which many take out of context to mean total freedom to do as you please, does not escape this, as it's issued within the context of the system. Rule Zero is often presented as the GM can change, ignore, or modify the rules to suit the needs of the table, but this is merely a license, not a method. A license is a grant of freedom or authorization to act that is external to the subject. In this case, Rule Zero gives the GM permission to alter the rules, which says, you're allowed to change what you want, you are not bound to follow everything as written, and you may tailor the game to your group's needs. But it does not tell you how to do that, and certainly not how to do it responsibly. A method, by contrast, is an internal structured approach, a repeatable and reasoned process for achieving a goal. A method answers, what principles should guide the change? How do you evaluate consequences? How do you align your changes with the intended experience? And what should you preserve for the system to remain coherent? So, a method transforms raw permission, a license, into informed design. When Rule Zero is treated as only a license, it encourages making impulsive or ill-informed changes, undermining coherence, introducing ambiguity, and a failure to predict cascading effects. When Rule Zero is exercised as a method, the GM knows what the rules do within the system before changing them, considers what is gained and lost by changing them, preserves internal consistency, which may mean not making a change, and designs with intentionality and foresight, none of which can be done without system familiarity. You need to know what precisely you are changing before you change it. Otherwise, you collapse the system in unintended ways. Here's an example. ACKS-II is a deeply interconnected rule set. That's Adventurer, Conqueror, King system, Imperial Imprint. It's a deeply interconnected rule set, which makes it really a perfect testbed to illustrate how coherence breaks down when a single subsystem is altered carelessly. We're Rule Zeroing encumbrance away, a commonly enough discussed topic. In fact, as I was writing this script, had a couple of this particular concept sort of crossed my feed. I can't remember if it was YouTube or Facebook or wherever it was, but as I was in the middle of writing this particular portion, it crossed my feed. So it's commonly discussed. So we'll just ignore encumbrance. Everyone always moves at a maximum speed per turn or round, regardless of armor, equipment, or load. This may feel minor, but this causes a cascade of breakages. Though I won't go into everything that breaks as a result, I will show you how there is a exponential compounding of issues. I'll start small and then I'll go large. And that's really all I'm going to do. I'm going to do the immediate change and then also what changes that you might not even really expect changes. So movement rates vary vary significantly, based on armor and load. A character in plate with a heavy pack might be capable of half of the movement an unarmored, say, thief is capable of. By removing encumbrance, you are flattening movement. All characters now collapse into the same tactical range band because you've erased meaningful trade-offs between protection, equipment, and mobility, nullifying light armor builds. You've made symmetrical that which was designed asymmetrically intentionally. ACKS-II explicitly ties movement to class identity. Classes like Thief and Elven Nightblade are built on mobility and positioning to justify their lighter armor and lower hit points, and several of their class powers just turn off if they're above a specific carrying weight, such as acrobatics. And other abilities still, like climbing and sneaking, are directly affected by character speed, which is in large part, determined by encumbrance. So heavily armored characters now move at the same rate and outperform light builds at their own game if they decide to take abilities like acrobatics or climb, among others. You've collapsed class design asymmetry, unintentionally reducing class differentiation. But this is likely expected. It's an assumed consequence of removing encumbrance. One that isn't so apparent is the effect its removal will have on domain economics and mercantile logistics. It does reach that far. ACKS-II tightly connects character scale rules to mass scale logistics. Speed, and thereby encumbrance, informs things like overland travel, military logistics, and merchant caravan speeds, all derived from PC level rules. So the unintended consequence is that if you handwave encumbrance at the player level, you lose the through line of internal consistency when you ask the players to command a mercenary company, manage a caravan, or calculate domain travel. The world becomes incoherent because it no longer obeys the same rules at micro and macro levels. The encumbrance system in ACKS-II is not an isolated subsystem. It is a foundational piece that cascades upward from moment-to-moment adventuring to larger scale economics and warfare. Essentially, and to reiterate the point I made prior to the example, what this all boils down to is system familiarity. Because without understanding these rules, you are not modifying a system. You are discarding something you do not understand and therefore cannot assess or replace coherently. So, Rule 0 without rules familiarity or system familiarity is license without methodology. It is only after the GM has submitted to and understood the system that their use of Rule 0 becomes meaningful, intentional, and structurally sound. The GM is not over the game. The GM is a situated interpreter who is formed by the system. Therefore, they are qualified to reshape it. And Rule 0 is best understood not as design fiat, but as hermeneutic authority, the capacity to interpret, recontextualize, and adjust the rules only after having internalized them. The GM must first submit to the system in order to alter it with integrity. Otherwise, what results is not authorship, but incoherence. We can now crystallize my core point into a more formal principle. Rule 0 is not a replacement for system comprehension. It is a post-comprehension act of secondary authorship, not sovereign design. This means the GM is not designing from scratch. They're engaging in design within constraints after having internalized the system's mechanical structure, its implied player behavior, its genre assumptions, and its interlocking logic. Anything else is either ignorance or hubris, both masquerading as creativity. Rule 0 is not a blank check. It is a responsibility. It is not an escape hatch from the system. It is a formal element of the system that structures secondary design and authorship. The GM is not outside the game's authority, but is instead a licensed transgressor, a role that exists because the system itself grants it. It can only be exercised intelligently and creatively once the GM has first submitted to the system's logic, learned its shape, and understood its emergent effects, aka developed a methodology. To take what works and leaves the rest requires knowing why what works and how it is interconnected by understanding the relationships between it and what it supports. Otherwise, you are not curating a system. You are simply breaking it. I hope this was informative. This was a bit dense, but sometimes I get that way. If you've been watching any of my other videos, you probably can guess that I sort of kind of have a tendency to get dense. So thank you for sticking with me to the end. Next Monday, so this Monday upcoming, I'm going to be live on the channel with Chubby Funster again. He has a Kickstarter, and we're going to discuss all that there. The following week, DM Blackwell's coming back, and we're going to actually design some dropship spaceships, and that should be really fun. So please do join us for both of those. Thank you again for checking me out, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care, everyone.